Hello everyone. In today's video I'm going to show you how I took some scraps of lumber and some thrifted finds and turned them into beautiful holiday decor. The projects are easy and the cost was minimal. Please join me. For projects 1 and 2, I took a 2x4 that we had in our garage and had my husband cut it into various sizes. Once he was done, the pieces were sanded so that they were smooth and the corners were rounded. I then took out my DIY white swan and gave each piece 2 coats. While the paint was drying, I took out the new holly and pine mold from IOD. It has beautiful images of pine cones, holly, and sprigs of pine. I used air dry clay to make a mold of each one of the elements. I guess this would be a good time to introduce myself if you are new to my channel. My name is Marla, and I'm the owner and creator behind From Rust to Roses Vintage. I love to take thrown away items, forgotten items, and turn them into beautiful home decor. If you've watched my channel before, thank you so much, and welcome back. Once I had cast each of the molds, I got out the Titebond glue and began gluing the molds onto the blocks of wood. On one block I glued the holly, and on the other 2 blocks I used sprigs of pine and the 2 pine cones. Once all of the molds were glued down, I went back and gave each casting a coat of DIY white swan. DIY paint is a clay-based paint and it has to be sealed. So once that coat of paint had dried, I went back with liquid patina and gave the blocks and the castings a good coat. I don't think I mentioned it, but I am in California again, and this time I flew, and so I was very limited on the supplies I could bring with me. When I got here, I realized I had forgotten my dark wax. So I took out some fusion mineral paint in the color oakum, and I painted a light coat of oakum over all of the castings and the blocks, and then used a wet wipe to wipe back the excess. As a final touch, I glued a crystal drawer pull to the top of each one, which you will see in the pictures. I just love the way they turned out. You'll have to let me know what you think in the comments. I had brought 2 sets of the blocks of wood with me, and so I decided that I would make another trio, but this time I wanted to go in a completely different direction. And so I got out my lock and key mold and began casting all of the elements I wanted to use to form a Christmas tree on one of the blocks. I didn't videotape it, but as you can see, I painted one of the blocks in a dark green. I believe this is Everett by Fusion Mineral Paint. And then I painted each of the castings with white swan. I glued the castings on and let them dry, and then I mixed together some gold mica powder and pigment fix, both from Pentart, and began to paint each one of the locks. To give the board a more vintage look, I mixed some of the oakum mineral paint with a little water and made a glaze. I then wiped back the excess with a wet wipe. I finished it off by putting a crystal drawer pull at the top, and then I went around the edges with some vintage gold rub and buff. I painted the taller board in a lighter green. This is Conservatory by Fusion Mineral Paint. And then I got out my old Christmas tree mold and cast that beautiful tree. I used my Titebond Quick and Thick to put a good coat of glue on the back, using a paintbrush this time to make sure I got it out to the edges of all of those branches on the tree. It took me a hot minute to get it onto the board the way I wanted it, but I decided that I wasn't going to cut off any of the branches, and so I just wrapped those around the edges. If little pieces fell off, I just made sure they had glue on them and put them back into place. I waited a little while for the mold to set, but before it was dry, I gave it a coat of DIY liquid patina. Sometimes it helps if you coat the mold with something like paint before it's dry. You won't get as much cracking, but as you can see here, I got a fair amount of cracking. Luckily, I love things that look old and vintage, so the cracking didn't bother me. I had gone over it with that wash of oakum paint and wiped that back, and now I'm using that gold metallic paint that I had made up to go over some of the little places on the tree where it looks like it could be a Christmas bulb, and highlighting that with the gold. Once I was done painting on the ornaments, I got out Heavy Body Gel by Pent Art and started applying it all over parts of the tree around those ornaments. I then sprinkled some German glass glitter over all of the places where I had applied the glue. I wanted to give my tree some sparkle. So here are all of the projects I made with the scrap wood. I did make a third block to go with the second set. However, I did not get that recorded. Projects 3 through 7 were all made out of thrifted finds, the majority of them being shelf sitters. So the first one here was a little shelf sitter that just said gather. I sanded the top of it to make sure that it would hold the paint, but I really wasn't concerned about getting that word gather off. I gave it a coat of white swan, and then in the second coat I mixed a small amount of oakum into the white paint to give it a slightly antique white color. I chose a couple of transfers out of one of the new IOD holiday release transfer booklets. I chose this one of Santa dumping out a bag full of toys because I knew that there was another transfer in there that had a saying about Santa and how he makes the toys for children. As you can probably see, I'm using my finger to put down the transfers. I was certain that I had tossed some transfer sticks into my suitcase, but I couldn't find them. But the transfers go on so easily that I was able to put all of my transfers on just using my fingers. Once I had the transfers on, I sanded the wood and then gave the whole project a coat of liquid patina. While the liquid patina was still wet, I went in with my decrepit dust and went all along the edges to give it a more vintage look. If I use this method, then I can go back with my finger and blend that decrepit dust out into the picture so there's not a dark, harsh line, but it looks more like it has just acquired some dust and dirt over time. I also make sure to add a little extra to the corners to make it look more authentic. I continue to use my fingers and the dust until I get exactly the look that I'm going for. The next project also started out as a shelf sitter. I think I picked this up at Goodwill for about 69 cents. I gave it a good sanding again so that the paint would stick. I knew it was going to take a couple of coats of paint to cover that black, but I decided I wanted something different from just a plain white shelf sitter. So I took some blue paint and some white paint, and I dipped my brush in half into the blue and half into the white, and then I painted it, giving it sort of the appearance of the sky. And then I continued until I had the entire piece painted. Once it was dry, I got out this garland transfer and put it along the top. In the Partridge Lane transfer book, there are some little dangling ornaments, and I thought it would be cute to put those on here to make them look like they are hanging down from that garland. Once I had all of the ornaments on, I gave the piece a coat of DIY liquid patina. I finished the piece off by applying some Van Dyke antiquing paste around all of the edges. I then took a clean paper towel and used it to blend that antiquing paste. This is a step you could skip if you don't like the distressed look. The next project started out as a block of wood that had been painted black. I think it was intended to be a shelf sitter, but apparently no one ever finished it. Again, I gave it a good coat of DIY White Swan, and then decided that I wanted to try to match some of the colors in the transfer I'd picked out. So I mixed a little bit of the conservatory green with some white and used that to paint the block of wood. I had picked out this beautiful transfer of two birds adding the garland to a Christmas tree, and I thought the green color went with it perfectly. Very easy upcycle. Just paint the block of wood, add this beautiful transfer, do some distressing if you like, or leave it, and you're done. I guess I did forget to mention one of the most important steps, and that's once the transfer is on, you need to seal it in. Again, I'm using my DIY liquid patina. And as you have probably guessed, especially if you've watched many of my videos, I almost always distress because I love the vintage look that it gives to my projects. The next project started out as a stack of blocks, also a shelf sitter. Looks like it was made for Valentine's Day. It had a ribbon taped to it, several stickers on the back, and then a little heart glued on the front. I thought the heart would be the easiest thing to get off, but as it turns out, it proved to be the hardest thing to get off. Once I managed to get it off, I got out sandpaper and sanded the piece, and then used a wet wipe to wipe off all the sanding dust before I started to paint it. I knew I was going to use milk paint on this project, so I wanted to give it a base of a dark color that would show through the crackle if I was lucky enough to get the milk paint to crack. I am using my little jar of Oakham. Again, it's a fusion mineral paint, and I love the tester sizes because they are easy to travel with. And they have a built-in primer and sealer, so that saves a little extra space in the suitcase as well. For this project, I am using the color Pantry Door by Sweet Pickins Milk Paint. It's a nice soft green. You mix the milk paint 1-to-1, paint to water, but sometimes I use a little less water because I find that a thicker paint will crack easier. Once I have it all mixed, I do let it sit for about 10 minutes before I paint my project. After giving the project one coat of the milk paint, I did get out my hairdryer and use it to try and force some cracking in the paint. I ended up giving the project a total of 2 coats of paint, using my hairdryer as a heat gun after each coat to force some crackle. I did get quite a bit of crackle, and I went over it with a wash of Oakham mineral paint and water to bring out the cracks. Because the mineral paint has a built-in sealer, I could go right over the top of it with my transfer. I chose this transfer from Partridge Lane. This is the partridge in the pear tree, which I thought most people would recognize from the 12 Days of Christmas. That particular transfer worked to cover the top 2 blocks, and for the bottom block, I grabbed a transfer that said Christmas Greetings. As a final touch, I added a small piece of garland I had cut in half to the bottom. I then sealed in the transfers with DIY liquid patina. You'll have to let me know what you think of this project. I like it so much better than the original Valentine's Day shelf sitter. How about you? For my last project, I grabbed this board that had a clip on the front of it. I don't know if it was to clip a picture or a recipe or whatever, but I took the clip out and then I sanded down that spot because I wasn't sure I was going to put the clip back in. Once I had it sanded and cleaned, I mixed some of my DIY paint with the Oakham to give it sort of a grayish brown tone, and then I went over the entire piece with 2 coats. There was a transfer in one of the booklets that I had been wanting to use for quite a while. I had just never found the right thing to put it on. It's a beautiful Christmas tree surrounded by garlands, and so I decided I would put that on this board. I had to do a little cutting on the garland to make it fit and not cover up the words that are behind the Christmas tree or that beautiful butterfly at the bottom. But it turned out great, and you can't tell that they have been cut and repositioned, but that's the beauty of these transfers. You don't always have to put them on the exact way that they come out of the book. Here's a final look at all of the beautiful projects I was able to make over the course of a few days, just using scraps of a 2x4 and some thrifted items I picked up at the Goodwill. I love every one of them. There's nothing here that I would not use in my own home, and in fact sometimes it's very difficult for me to put these in my booth to sell because I like them so much. If you stayed to the end, thank you so much for watching my video. It truly means a lot to me, and your viewing definitely is helping my channel to grow. If you liked what you saw, I hope you will consider subscribing to my channel and to give me a thumbs up or leave a comment. Thank you so much again, and have a wonderful week.